Hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Friday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, the first graphic showing strong wind gusts. Big storm bringing strong winds to the southeast Bering Sea from the Pribilofs to the central Aleutians eastward to Unalaska Dutch Harbor, and winds on the increase over the Alaska Peninsula this afternoon. Peak wind gusts so far, at least the last time I looked, close to 100 miles an hour there at Nikolsky, with peak wind gusts of 98 miles an hour. And Atka St. George had peak wind gusts of 68 miles per hour, while Adak, 64 miles an hour, and so far in Alaska and Cold Bay, about 56 miles per hour. And with those strong winds, especially at Nikolsky there's a high wind warning out for this evening until 1 a.m. Saturday morning for the Fox Islands, Nikolsky, Unalaska Dutch Harbor area, for winds of, 40 to 60 miles per hour with gusts to 90 miles per hour, which has already been exceeded there, but those strong winds are expected to continue until 1 a.m., and then they should drop off markedly, actually, after midnight tonight. And from there, up over the Klondike Highway, there's a winter weather advisory out above 1,500 feet, again for the Klondike Highway, and looking for additional snowfall amounts of 3 to 5 inches, and snow showers occasionally heavy, continuing through late afternoon and then tapering off by early evening. And travel will be difficult. Visibility will be reduced in heavier snow showers. And again, you can see the snowfall amounts there, anywhere from 2 to 3 inches around Haines, over toward Haines Custom, maybe White Pass picking up about 4 inches of snow, and Haines Airport expecting an inch or less. And for the satellite imagery, you can see kind of there is low pressure, not kind of low pressure. There is low pressure off the just south of the northeastern North Gulf Coast, pushing surges of moisture into the Panhandle. Rainfall today, heaviest precipitation was over the southeast coast, and then also over the Pribilof Islands as well, with that frontal boundary there with the intense storm moving just north of the eastern Aleutian areas. Otherwise, not too bad, just kind of variably cloudy over south central Alaska, with some clearing over the southeast interior areas, and then a lot of cloudiness over the west central part of the state up to the Brooks Range area. And then it sort of thins out over the north slope, and then heavier clouds along the Arctic coast. They're a little bit thicker. But the system moving through the Panhandle brought the heaviest rainfall amounts to the southern southeast coast today, and a lot of cold, unstable air aloft moving in, bringing the snowfall levels down in that area. Precipitation-wise, Ketchikan picked up about 0.7 of an inch of rainfall, while, Klawock and Petersburg had about a 1/2 inch of precipitation, and then lighter amounts up to the north. Juneau picked up about 1/4 inch of rain during that same time period, and even lighter amounts over toward Yakutat, mostly in the form of rain, occasionally mixed with snow there for the eastern North Gulf Coast, but pretty light. And snowfall at Cordova ended early this morning, otherwise basically dry across the Copper River Basin, south central Alaska, Kuskokwim Valley, all the way out to the southwest coast, and then that deep storm bringing the strong winds. You can see the very tight gradient there right over Nikolsky, where they had that 98 mile per hour wind gust today. And St. George Island reported a water equivalent 12-hour rainfall amount of 0.85 inches, and that all fell in the form of wet snow. Temperatures around the mid-30s today. Both at St. Paul and St. George, precipitation fell in the form of snow there, with strong winds, again, up to 68 miles an hour to the northeast at St. George Island, east-northeast winds. Wind, rain, and snow on the increase for the Alaska Peninsula, with the rain right at sea level, and then any elevation at all, you got mixture or just plain snow. And up over the central interior, areas of light snow or snow showers with some possible areas of fog along the Yukon River, north and south there, and up over the north slope to the Arctic coast, but amounts pretty darn light there. And showers ending over the central Aleutians, as well as slowly diminishing winds for Adak and Atka today, with maybe a little bit of clearing. In the forecast for tonight, that low tracks across the Alaska Peninsula this evening, and by about 3 a.m. should be south or southeast of Sitkinak Island. So it'll be quite windy and wet for Kodiak Island tonight, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Winds increase there for the Alaska Peninsula. Possible gusts 60 to 70 miles per hour to the north and northwest. Wind and rain and snow increasing for the North Gulf Coast, southern Cook Inlet, and to a certain extent into Prince William Sound. And look for rain to increase late tonight along the coast of the Panhandle. The front's still a ways off to your west and southwest there. But weak low pressure just south of the Seward Peninsula keeps snow showers scattered along just about all of the west coast areas there. Maybe dry for the Kuskokwim Delta coast with kind of more of an offshore flow component to the low-level winds there, but still areas of flurries and fog over the central interior areas. And same thing for the Arctic coast. Winds not too bad up there tonight. Should pick up a little bit tomorrow, looking, I believe, small craft advisories along the Arctic coast, central and eastern Arctic coast, 30 knots on the east side, 25 knots on the west side for Saturday, and probably into Sunday as well. Otherwise, south of the Brooks Range, pretty dry for the day tomorrow, and just some snow showers possible along the Alaska Range. Rain and snow cutting off around Turnagain Arm and the central Kenai Peninsula, and wind swinging around to the northwest for Kodiak Island. That'll start to pull the snowfall levels back down again with the colder air coming in. In fact, snowfall levels falling to near sea level all the way down to the Alaska Peninsula. Maybe the eastern Aleutians there will be kind of touch and go for those areas, but definitely snow for the Pribilofs in the form of showers, light snow showers, and kind of an extensive area of light snow, low clouds and fog over the central Bering Sea with the cold air coming down out of the Russian Far East and through the Bering Strait. Otherwise, for the Panhandle, storm force winds on the north coast and the eastern North Gulf Coast with gale warnings on the south coast, but rain heavy at times, all areas there. And then moving to Sunday, that low center doesn't move too much. It drifts eastward and really slows down due to the cold air coming out over the western Gulf of Alaska. Look for strong gusty northwest winds for Kodiak Island, storm force winds for the Barrens and Kamishak Bay, and also for Cook Inlet, pretty gusty winds there. 30 to 40 knots for the marine areas, and northeast for Bristol Bay, for Prince William Sound, northwest for Bristol Bay. Only some scattered snow showers there, kind of a continuous kind of a zone there of snow showers from the Kuskokwim Delta coast, clipping Cape Newenham down to the central Alaska Peninsula, and then actually a chance of snow showers all along the west coast of Alaska with the cold air, but the wind's much lighter now, high pressure building in across the southern Bering Sea there. So light winds, dry conditions, maybe some sun breaks for the central eastern Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula and Pribilofs. Next system, weaker, staying back to the northwest there, really not affecting the area until probably Sunday evening for Shimi and Attu. Otherwise, dry and cold over the central and eastern interior of the state, and it stays wet with continued south and southwest flow, bringing surges of moisture in off the Pacific into the Panhandle. And then I went the wrong way. Let me go back the other way. Lows for tonight. There we go. Get the right key here. 30s for the Panhandle, a little below zero, Copper River Basin, 0 to 5 for the Kuskokwim Valley. Otherwise in the teens to lower 20s, near freezing for Kodiak. Highs tomorrow, 40s to near 50, warmest in the southern southeast coast. Teens for the Kuskokwim Valley, Copper River Basin, 30 to 35, south central Alaska, mid-40s Kodiak Island. Lows, single numbers, Copper River Basin, Kuskokwim Valley, much milder over the Panhandle in the 30s to near 40, followed by highs in the 40s for the southeast coast, near 20 in the Copper River Basin, mid-teens in the Kuskokwim Valley, and mid to upper 20s, south central Alaska, mid-30s, Kodiak Island. And up to the north, single numbers to a little below zero in the Brooks Range there, but 5 to 15 for the Arctic coast, and lower 20s out toward the Bering Strait. Highs tomorrow, 5 to 10 for the Brooks Range North Slope, milder for the Arctic coast, and in the teens south of the Brooks Range to the Alaska Range. And a few more below zero readings for Sunday morning, and for the highs on Sunday afternoon in the teens south of the Brooks Range to mid-teens to lower 20s for the Arctic coast. Lows around 20 for the southwest coast tonight, otherwise mid to upper 30s for the Aleutians. Highs tomorrow in the 40s for the Aleutians.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather. Not too bad over the interior for Saturday morning. Just a little bit of marginal VFR across the southern part of the state there. And then some IFR up along the central eastern Arctic coast, but the Bering Sea looking pretty good with VFR from Mack Island westward. Some marginal VFR through the Bering Straits and the Seward Peninsula, down to the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians, IFR there along the Alaska Peninsula into Kodiak Island, and also western Prince William Sound down to possibly Resurrection Bay. For the afternoon, looking something like this. IFR, northeastern Kodiak Island, Fognak Island, and then eastward there to Yakutat and down across much of the southeast coast now. IFR continues central eastern Arctic coast, but the Brooks Range down to the Yukon River and southward. VFR, picking up some marginal VFR along the Alaska Range and 40-mile country there to just north of Eagle. Togiak Bay, VFR, northeast Bristol Bay to Iliamna Lake, VFR, and still really good out over the Aleutians, the entire Aleutian chain. VFR flying weather tomorrow, or for Saturday afternoon to the western Alaska Peninsula, but marginal for the Pribilofs northward to the Bering Strait. And then for Sunday morning, good VFR out over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, Pribilof Islands. Some marginal VFR along the Alaska Range up into the central upper Tanana Valley northward to the Yukon Flats, and marginal VFR for most of the Arctic coast. Marginal VFR for the Noatak Valley, northwest coast, Kotzebue, maybe into Selawik, and the western Seward Peninsula, especially the north coast. IFR there near Yakutat into the northern Panhandle. And for the afternoon Sunday, finally some lower conditions out over the Bering Sea. Now the entire Bering Sea is painted marginal VFR. Call it areas of there from the Bering Strait southward to the Aleutians. IFR coming into the Shimiatu area. Kodiak Fognak Island, VFR surrounded by marginal VFR that extends up into Kamishak Bay, southern Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle, and Cook Inlet. Madanuska, at least the western Madanuska Valley, Susitna Valley, all VFR into the southern Kuskokwim Valley, and the eastern Arctic coast, eastern North Slope, VFR. And the Tuvik for Saturday, VFR on either approach for both passes. Lake Clark and Merrill, occasional marginal VFR likely tomorrow. And same forecast for rainy, occasionally marginal throughout the day on Saturday, and windy, occasional marginal VFR, especially on the northern entrance. Isabel, marginal VFR at times, especially north side. And Mentasta, VFR, northern entrance could be marginal at times throughout the day Saturday. And for Tanita, VFR. And Portage, marginal VFR, possible IFR at times on the east entrance, especially early on. And for Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 feet all the way down to Sitkinak Island, still north of the Pribilofs, though, for tomorrow morning, cutting across the central Panhandle, 2,000 feet to Prince of Wales Island. So definitely things cooling off. Alaska Peninsula, 2,000 feet. And for icing, with that storm coming into the Gulf and the front pushing in across the Panhandle, look for some areas of considerable moderate rime icing along in advance of the front, above about, say, 4,000 feet. And then for the jet stream, northwest winds across the central western Bering Sea up to 90 knots, but the main jet now south of the Aleutians, 100 to 145 knots, cutting in across the Queen Charlotte Islands, just clipping the southern Panhandle with maybe 90-knot winds there. And at 9,000 feet, starting up in the Arctic coast, east-southeast winds there on the central coast, possibly as high as 35 knots. Otherwise, pretty light over the mainland Alaska area, out over the Bering Sea and along the southwest coast. Northwest winds 35 to 50 knots, strongest along the Alaska Peninsula and the Fox Islands. And northeast 40 for the western and northwest Gulf of Alaska. West-southwest 40 to 50 knots into the Panhandle. And looking at 3,000 feet, got the strongest winds there cutting south, maybe clipping the offshore Gulf area there in the marine zones, 65 to 70 knots, but lighter for the Panhandle. Northeasterlies, 40 to 50 knots there for the North Gulf Coast into the northwest Gulf of Alaska. And northerlies, 30 to 40 knots, central eastern Bering Sea up to 35 knots for the eastern Arctic coast. And considerable moderate turbulence expected for the Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, Bristol Bay, Kodiak, central eastern Aleutians.
Why is plastic marine debris so common? We know there's trash in the ocean. Unfortunately, a lot of it is plastic. We find plastic everywhere, from the ocean floor to surface. The plastics are all shapes and sizes and all different types. We find plastics on beaches, and also inside animals' stomachs or wrapped around their bodies. That's bad news for our ocean and the animals that live in it and near it. It's also bad news for us. A recent study from the University of Georgia estimated that 8 million metric tons of plastic trash enters the ocean every year. That's like putting 5 bags filled with plastic on every foot of coastline in the world. That's a lot of plastic in the ocean, and it's there because, well, we put it there. The 5 most common items found during the International Coastal Cleanup are plastic cigarette butts, food wrappers, plastic beverage bottles, plastic bottle caps, and plastic straws and drink stirrers. Notice anything in common with those? It's a lot of single-use, disposable plastic. It goes without saying, we produce too much waste. That waste ends up in the ocean when we litter or don't recycle. Plastic is an important part of our modern lives. We use it for a lot of good things. But we need to take responsibility for how much we use every day and where it goes when we're done with it. The 3 R's can help, and it's up to every single one of us to practice them. Reduce your use of disposable plastic. That's anything you use once and throw away. Just use less. Reuse disposable plastics when possible. A plastic bottle makes a great coin piggy bank or watering can. The possibilities are endless. Recycle anything that can be recycled so it stays out of landfills, where trash can blow away. Ocean plastic is a huge problem that's only going to get worse. Unless we change our ways, we can do better for the ocean and for us. Why is plastic marine debris so common? We know there's trash in the ocean. Unfortunately, a lot of it is plastic. We find plastic everywhere, from the ocean floor to surface. The plastics are all shapes and sizes and all different types. We find plastics on beaches, and also inside animals' stomachs or wrapped around their bodies. That's bad news for our ocean and the animals that live in it and near it. It's also bad news for us. A recent study from the University of Georgia estimated that 8 million metric tons of plastic trash enters the ocean every year. That's like putting 5 bags filled with plastic on every foot of coastline in the world. That's a lot of plastic in the ocean, and it's there because, well, we put it there. The 5 most common items found during the International Coastal Cleanup are plastic cigarette butts, food wrappers, plastic beverage bottles, plastic bottle caps, and plastic straws and drink stirrers. Notice anything in common with those? It's a lot of single-use, disposable plastic. It goes without saying, we produce too much waste. That waste ends up in the ocean when we litter or don't recycle. Plastic is an important part of our modern lives. We use it for a lot of good things. But we need to take responsibility for how much we use every day and where it goes when we're done with it. The 3 R's can help, and it's up to every single one of us to practice them. Reduce your use of disposable plastic. That's anything you use once and throw away. Just use less. Reuse disposable plastics when possible. A plastic bottle makes a great coin piggy bank or watering can. The possibilities are endless. Recycle anything that can be recycled so it stays out of landfills, where trash can blow away. Ocean plastic is a huge problem that's only going to get worse. Unless we change our ways, we can do better for the ocean and for us.
What is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? Well, first, let's talk about what it's not. It's not a floating island of trash like a garbage dump or a landfill. It's also not the only patch. They exist all throughout the ocean, and the Pacific Garbage Patch just happens to be the most famous. Garbage patches are large areas of marine debris concentration that are formed by rotating ocean currents called gyres, kind of like big whirlpools that suck things in. A garbage patch is made up of tiny plastic pieces called microplastics that are less than 5 millimeters long. It's more like pepper flakes swirling in a soup than something you can skim off the surface. You might come across some larger items like plastic bottles, but it's possible to sail through a garbage patch and not see anything. And they're a big problem for the ocean and us. People often ask why we can't just scoop up all the marine debris in the ocean. And the answer is, unfortunately, it's just not that simple. The first challenge is the sheer size of these garbage patches. They're huge. They're constantly moving with ocean currents. And there's debris from the ocean surface all the way down to the sea floor. Not to mention all the marine life we would disrupt if we tried to just scoop up debris. So what can we do? Well, the ultimate solution is prevention. And we need to keep that as our highest priority. We can reduce, reuse, and recycle to keep trash out of the ocean in the first place. And we can participate in things like shoreline cleanups. It's a lot easier to deal with debris before it gets to the ocean. Because until we stop marine debris at the source, we'll just be cleaning it up forever.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to coastal water forecast for the southern panhandle. Gale warnings for the day Saturday. Southeast winds 40 to 45 knots. And for the north coast, south to east winds 45 to 50 knots with seas 20 to 23 feet. Lynn Canal, much lighter winds there, south at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Small craft advisories for Stevens Passage. Southeast winds 25 knots with higher gusts. Gale warnings for Clarence Strait for southeast winds at 35 knots. And for the day on Saturday, or Sunday, second day of the weekend, on the south coast, pretty good gales continue. Southwest at 45 knots with 35-foot seas. And for the central coast, southwest at 30 knots. And the north coast, east-northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings continue for Clarence Strait for southerly winds at 35 knots. Look for southeast winds at 25 for Stevens Passage. And Lynn Canal, winds will be out of the north at 20 knots. Prince William Sound, Saturday, northeast winds 30 knots, sea 6 feet. Storm warnings for the eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds at 50 knots. And east winds 45 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Barren Islands, northeast winds 45 knots. Kamishak Bay, gale warnings, northeast winds 40 knots. And Cook Inlet, gale warnings for north winds 30 to 40 knots with seas south of the Forelands as high as 11 feet. Lighter winds in store for Cook Inlet on Sunday, falling back to 10 to 20 knots from the north. But storm warnings for Kamishak Bay, northwest winds 50 knots. Same forecast for the Barren Islands, northwest at 50. Western North Gulf Coast, small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots. Winds coming down out of the northeast to 15 knots for Prince William Sound, north 15 for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, Saturday, gale warnings, north to northwest winds 40 to 45 knots. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 35 to 45 knots. North winds 30 knots for Bristol Bay. And then for Kodiak Island on Sunday, storm warnings, northwest winds 50 knots with higher gusts. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, northwest winds 35 knots. Eastern Aleutians on Saturday, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots and northwest winds 30 knots for the west central Aleutians, far western Aleutians, northwest at 25. And then on Sunday, winds turn south at 25 knots for the western Aleutians, central Aleutians, southwesterlies at 20 to 25 knots, eastern Aleutians, west winds 20 to 30 knots. For Saturday, for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, gale warnings, north winds 35 knots, small craft advisories for the Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island, and St. Matthew Island for northwest winds at 25 knots. Pribilof Islands, winds will be northwest at 30 knots. And for Sunday, Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island, west winds 25 knots, southwest coast, northwesterlies at 30 knots, and St. Lawrence Island looking at a northwest wind at 25 knots. Up along the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Saturday, small craft advisories, east winds sustained at 30 knots, western Arctic coast, Small craft advisories too for east winds at 25 knots. And then northeast to southeast winds for the Chukchi Sea at about 15 knots. And for the day Sunday, no change for the central and eastern Arctic coast. East winds still sustained at 30 knots, seas 6 to 8 feet. Western Arctic coast, east winds 25 knots. And from Cape Thompson to Cape Beaufort, northeast at 15. And then Cape Thompson to Wales, northwest winds at 20 knots with seas up to 9 feet. Otherwise, for the Arctic coast itself, seas running 6 to 8 feet. And for tonight, intense storm moves across the Alaska Peninsula this evening and early tonight. High wind warning for the eastern Aleutians until 1 a.m. Saturday. The winds will come down considerably. Wind and rain will be a dark and stormy night tonight for Kodiak Island and the North Gulf Coast. Rain and snow with gusty winds, gales and storm force winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast, north coast of the Panhandle with rain increasing. Otherwise, the interior, not too bad. Areas of light snow and cold temperatures continue through Saturday, becoming drier, though, over interior Alaska. And wind swinging around to the northwest for Kodiak Island in the afternoon, becoming quite strong. And wind and rain for the southeast coast. And for Sunday, that low stays off the north coast of the Panhandle. Look for cold, windy conditions, Kodiak Island up into south central Alaska. Cold and dry over much of interior Alaska with just some scattered snow showers over the Alaska Peninsula and southwest coast. Next system, pretty weak, not bringing too much weather into the forecast area.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.